started the recording. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Today, I have the immense pleasure of welcoming Wade Hans. Wade is a distinguished and major historian, philosopher, epistemologist, and methodologist of economics. I've had the great honor of having so many exchanges with Wade over the last few years. And other than that, of course, I've had the pleasure of reading his significant writings, a really large number of remarkable papers and books. Among the papers he has written on various topics, from older writings on Popper to newer writings on Samuelson, on Hayek, but also on Frank Knight, and also other papers on behavioral economics. And Wade also wrote in 2001 a book, Reflections Without Rules, which won the History of Economics Best Book Prize in 2004. And he has also won various awards for some of his articles. I should also mention that last year, or maybe yes, it was, I think, last year or 2 years ago, a book came out entitled Methodology and History of Economics, Reflections with and Without Rules, edited by Bruce Caldwell, John Davis, Uskali Maki, and Esther Miriam Sand, which was, the book is, I really encourage you to read it, is dedicated to Wade's career, distinguished and remarkable career. But of course, it also deals with the book from 2001. And last but not least, Wade, other than his remarkable writings, he has been the former editor with John Davis of the Journal of Economic Methodology, and also he was a former president of the History of Economic Society. So a really stellar career, but also amazing ongoing research, such as this paper, which deals with Frank Knight and behavioral economics. So without any further ado, I give you the floor. Wade, thank you so much. Again, I'm really grateful that you accepted my invitation. You will have 60 to 75 minutes, and depending on the length of your talk, we will have the remainder of the talk for the Q&A, knowing that just after your talk, who is a PhD student at the Walras-Pareto Center in Lausanne, he will discuss your talk. Rafael is basically doing a PhD on Frank Knight, so he was really interested in the talk, and this could also be an interesting opportunity for him to discuss your ideas in the paper, and of course in the talk. So the floor is yours.
Okay,
please.
Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm sorry to say that after that wonderful introduction, I evidently don't know how to share my screen. So, so I'm going to be saying click, click, click once in a while. So, if you would like to click, I can move on here.
Absolutely.
Yes. Next. Yes. Let me say just a little bit. Yeah. Get one more picture. One more picture. Now hold. Yeah. I mean, Frank Knight and behavioral economics. I mean, these are not two topics one would normally think about putting together. I mean, part of it is just that behavioral economics is such an important thing. And I struggle with it because I'm not someone who is a great champion of behavioral economics, and nor am I a critic of behavioral economics, because I don't think it's one thing. I think it's many things. The two big things are, one is behavioral economics as an empirical experiments in testing individual behavior and seeing what people actually do relative to what expected utility theory would say they should do. that's I would call that positive behavioral economics, or based on prediction and explanation. That part of it, I'm very supportive. I mean, like everybody else, there's certain experiments I don't have a lot of faith in, but overall, I certainly think it's going to change economics and has changed economics. On the other hand, there's behavioral welfare economics. And I think, like so many people, that behavioral economics has profound impacts on our traditional mainstream Pareto tradition. I mean, it's an individual preference satisfaction based tradition of welfare. And if behavioral economics is right and what people choose is not necessarily what satisfies their preferences, then you've driven a wedge between what you can observe and what welfare is. And that sort of spun out this whole behavioral economics thing. So, I'm like I say, there's two parts to the story: the positive behavioral economics and behavioral welfare economics. I've had a long-standing interest in Knight. I have a lot of respect for Frank Knight, even though I disagree with him on many, many, many things. Knight is one of those people that really goes his own way. And even though he's a free market economist and he was one of the founders of the Montpellieran Society, and you can take all that political baggage you want, but he also dug in his heels on various philosophical positions and went contrary to the Chicago school of the 70s and 80s, many of them being his students. So I have a lot of respect for him. And he has he has a pluralist vision of things, and I tend to have a pluralist vision of things. So it makes sense to me to talk about what would Frank Knight say about behavioral economics. And I've written on Knight before, but not with respect to behavioral economics. I've written on behavioral economics before, but not with respect to Knight. And I thought it was time to put the two together. So, okay. You can just click through there's like, yeah, keep going. Two more. Okay. So the first part's going to be Knight and how Knight views homo economist or rational choice theory, and then how Knight would respond to the experimental literature in behavioral economics, the positive behavioral economics. And then I'll talk a little bit about normative behavioral economics. A lot of you know a lot about it anyway. And the only kind of practical normative behavioral economics I'm going to talk about is libertarian paternalism. And then I'll talk about what Knight would say about libertarian paternalism, or what I believe Knight would say about libertarian paternalism. And then I have one final sort of throwaway point at the end. So click. Yeah. Okay, let's hold on those two. Knight had, you have to remember, his intellectual foundation is turn of the century America in some sense. I was influenced by positivism, even though read German and had strong German influences as well. And his vision of what science is a very narrow vision compared to what most of us think about science. His vision is a kind of inductive positivism, not even logical positivism, but the positivism of the late 19th century. And it's, every time you have an A, you have a B. Every time you have an A, you have a B. Every time you have an A, you have a B. So therefore you have a law. And so laws are extremely narrowly defined. Scientific laws for Knight are very narrowly defined. Most philosophers of economics don't take that view, because if you have a very narrow definition of what science is, you're not going to have much economics that comes out being science, right? And this is part of the irony of Knight. I mean, here's Knight, who's a supporter in some sense of homo economists and rational economic activity. And yet he's defining science in a way that makes that almost impossible at a practical level. And this tension is in Knight throughout his life. This pluralism makes him what I call an anti-naturalist. Naturalism here is not used the way it is in contemporary philosophy. I mean, naturalism today is sort of Quine and all of that. Naturalism here simply means, is there only one science? And is there one methodology of science? And should the social sciences use the same methodology as the natural sciences? So a naturalist would say there's only one scientific method, and an anti-naturalist would say, no, there's scientific pluralism. There's a variety of different, and I'm not talking about, religion or mysticism. I'm talking about there's pluralism within science, within the scientific endeavor. There's various ways of doing science. And so Knight is an anti-naturalist throughout his career and is fighting this naturalism everywhere. And he sees scientific social science as a kind of an entryway to science running our lives, every aspect of our lives. And so he has this anti-naturalistic impulse. And I argue at the end that that's one of the reasons he has a narrow conception of science. Is part of it is the context he's in, but part of it is also that he wants to be a scientist, but he wants to have science pluralist, and natural science being a very small subset of that total set. So, okay, yeah, click on here. I think I can do, yeah. So this is, I just said this, right? Knight was writing during the first half of the 20th century. The heady days of positivism and criticizing naturalism in the human sciences meant explaining how the human sciences were different from that which was generally accepted as the received view of natural science at the time. So he took the view of science at the time and used it to criticize the sort of overreach of certain social scientists, particularly American institutionalists, but others as well. And then the final click here on this slide. Thanks. Knight's views on rational choice and the applicability of rational choice theory, the applicability of homo economicus to explain the behavior of real humans, that changed over time. And there's quite a bit of literature on this. Ross Emmett has done quite a bit. His view early on in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit in his PhD thesis was fairly pro-rational choice in the sense that, yes, you can use this to predict and explain real activity most of the time. And then what happens over his lifetime is he never gives it up. He never says we shouldn't be doing it in any way, shape, or form. But he makes it smaller and smaller in terms of the domains in which it's effective. And so he moves away from support of rational choice, not moves all the way away, but decreases the amount of things that he thinks rational choice can apply to. And so that's always running in the background of this story. So my discussion of Knight is not the early Knight at all. As I said in the paper, it's from, say, 22 on, although on various topics he backslides. On various topics he will hold on to it or release it depending on what the topic is. Okay, yes, thank you. So let me, click a couple more here. So if I'm going to be comparing Knight to behavioral economics, there's a big time gap there. And there's always this problem in history, or history of science, or the history of economic thought, of trying to compare two figures that, or two groups of people that have a large period of time between them, because things change, right? What Knight means by evidence is not what Kahneman means by evidence. What Knight means by rational is not what behavioral economics today mean as rational. What Knight means by normative is not what they mean by normative. So you have all this problem of comparing these two things. And so and also, since Knight changed his view about sort of the practical usefulness of rational choice theory over time, where do I pick, if I want to talk about what Knight thinks about rational choice compared to behavioral, what Knight do I pick? Do I pick early Knight, middle Knight, late Knight, whatever? So instead of picking a particular time period in Knight's life, what I decided to do was to say, okay, let's pick two things about rational choice that Knight always had and never gave up, okay? And the first one is the definition of rational choice. Rational choice is instrumental rationality, economizing with respect to given goals and constraints, right? So you have a phenomenon that is economics, right? It means to achieve ends. So you have given ends and you achieve those ends economically, efficiently. If the problem is defined narrowly enough that you can solve it as a mathematical problem, then you maximize. But if you can't, you just do it as efficiently as possible. That's his view of rational choice. It was his view in his PhD thesis, and it was his view at the end of the life. So we can talk about that as something that didn't change. And click. And then the other thing that didn't change is his epistemic justification of rational choice. And it's similar to John Stuart Mill in a sense, even though that's a much different generation and much different economics. The argument is basically that if you want to have economics be a science in the positivist spirit, this is the only way you can do it. Because if a science is something that has universal laws, then how are you going to apply a universal law to people? We change our minds all the time. We do all kinds of crazy things. We think fuzzy, we change, we have free will. How could you have a science? Well, you could have a science if you had a fairly narrow conception of what the economic agent was. So what you have is this homo economist, and you have well-behaved preferences. You maximize those preferences relative to the constraints that you face. It's a model, but it's a model that is tight enough, right, that you actually, homo economist obeys laws, scientific laws. Now, there may be scientific laws for model behavior as opposed to actual behavior, but they're scientific laws. In no other sense, so I'm reading here in the blue, in no other sense can there be laws of conduct or science of conduct. The only possible science of conduct is that which treats the behavior of the economic man. A scientific principle necessarily takes the form that under given conditions, certain things can be counted on to happen. And in homo economist, you do have certain things that can be counted on to happen. I mean, if you're thinking about demand theory, the Slutsky substitution effect is always negative. I mean, that you can count on that. So rational economic man is consistent with positivism. Real people, real men may not be. So if we want to be a science, we have to keep it narrow in this way, which is a very, I think, very unusual way of talking about this. Okay, click. So how am I going to, you can, 2 more clicks, I think. Yeah. Yeah, there. Thank you. So if facts are different for Knight than they are for behavioral economics, I mean, evidence for Knight is introspective, it's common sense. You know, what would I do? What do I see people doing? It's not you know, an empirical analysis as we do it today. And so it's a different notion of empirical. And what I argue in the paper is that even though they have different notions, even though Knight and behavioral economics has different notions of what is empirical or what is an observation, you can still compare what they say about individual behavior, because the issues that we are talking about are conceptual issues that are common to both. For instance, Knight talks a lot about cases where individuals are making choices and they have irreversible preferences. So, you know, you prefer A to B, and then they ask you again if you prefer A to B, and you say no, you prefer B to. So preference reversal kinds of things. Knight argues that we do those kinds of things all the time, that we have endowment effects. And now he doesn't use any of this terminology. This is behavioral terminology, but it's concepts that Knight talks about, irreversibility, those kinds of things. And so my argument is the concepts are the same to Knight. You know, if where you start is extremely important to where you end up, and if you can't reverse, if you can't, your preferences jump around all the time, basically, then that's a conceptual problem. And the fact that Frank Knight thought of that problem in terms of common sense, and modern behavioral economics thinks of it in terms of empirical experiments, it's still the same concept. So you can compare the concept, even though the empirical evidence that they're using to support the concept is different. Okay. So I don't think there's an intertemporal incommensurability problem there. And then the deterministic versus risky choice. I mean, all of behavioral economics is about risky choice, whether it's prospect theory or whether it's expected utility theory. And even though Frank Knight is responsible for our definition of risky choice, he didn't think in terms of risky choice. When Knight was talking about rational behavior, he was talking about demand theory. He was talking about someone that's maximizing your utility subject to a budget constraint. And so how can you compare those two things? Well, it's fairly easy to compare those two things because there was a group of early on in behavioral economics, Thaler in particular, applied a lot of the endowment effect kinds of arguments and things like that Kahneman and Tversky had generated, and applied it to regular consumer choice theory. So the idea of having an endowment effect, of having irreversibility, those kinds of things are in the behavioral economics literature, even though it's not the majority of the behavioral economics literature. So you can actually compare them. Okay. Moving on. So there's a gap here because there's a few pages in the paper that talks about, has quotes about Knight talking about irreversibility and endowment effects and things like that. I've sort of left that out because I have quite a few slides here and I need to move along. And I think the constructed preferences thing is harder hitting. I think it's a much more sort of clear situation of where Knight is agreeing with positive behavioral economics, right? So I think we know what constructed preferences are, but it's just this idea that it's not that you have fixed preferences and then you go make a choice. It's that your preferences are constructed in the act of choice. And this, when this material was done originally, 20 years ago, this was viewed as a very radical thing. And there was a lot of resistance to it. And it is a view that is gaining momentum in a sense. Bernheim now is is taking this sort of view and trying to get welfare economics around it. And so this is a subset of behavioral economics, the constructed preferences literature, the preference reversal literature. And this is something that Knight says over and over and over, that we have constructed preferences, that we don't have preferences and come to choice, that our preferences are constructed in the act of choice. Okay, next page, next slide. And you can go on and click through. There's 3 quotes here. All right, yeah. All this says the same thing, right? This is Knight saying basically that you can't assume that people have a fixed utility function and they maximize it, that what they prefer is determined by the act of choice, right? It is undoubtedly a general principle that the ends more or less are defined in the process of realization. It's the interest and value in an action centers in this redefinition, as well as the achievement of the result or the anticipation. Second quote in the blue point. It may be seriously doubted whether there is any thinking at all about conduct which does not center on determining the end to be aimed at, or what the end is. So it's seeking an end as much as trying to achieve the end. And then the last one here, practically never are ends really wholly given or really ends. The general fact constitutes the main handicap of analytical economics, which by abstraction takes ends as given and defines it as a special field of inquiry. Taken alone, this instrumental view is unrealistic, repugnant to many minds, and will be very misleading on policy questions. So I don't think there's any doubt that Knight repeatedly made this case for what we now call constructed preferences. Now, he also talked about things that were kind of like reference dependent, kind of like context dependent, kind of like all of those. But I think the really hard-hitting part is the clarity of what's said in the constructed preferences literature today and what Knight said. There's a complete match. So, okay, click on. Yeah, let me just go and click through these 3 points because I don't, yeah, so, 3 major points on behavioral economics. Now, this is on positive behavioral economics. It's not going to be that way when we get to here soon and when we get to the welfare stuff. Homo economist frequently does not predict, explain, or even usefully rationalize the choice of actual humans. Frequently. Now, sometimes it does. Sometimes, but frequently it doesn't. It often is the case that an individual's endowment, reference point, and even context matters to the valuation of various outcomes and thus choices, right? So you have this path dependency and stuff. And then the last one, the constructed preferences part, humans often make choices that indicate that they do not have or even act as if they have preferences that are fixed before and stable throughout the choice process, but rather that preferences are constructed within the choice process itself. So we're going to have a session where people can ask questions and criticize, but I'm real comfortable with this. I'm not saying other people don't have different arguments, but this seems to me to be pretty clear. The behavioral welfare economic stuff is a little less clear to me even. Let's put it that way. So, okay, let's move on to the behavioral welfare. I think people will have a pretty good idea about what libertarian paternalism is. Let me just very quickly, run through this whole normative behavioral welfare economics. In the world of a 1970s microeconomic textbook, which is what I learned from, what you have is that individuals always maximize the well-behaved utility function. And individuals act in their own rational self-interest, and consequently individuals acting in their own self-interest and acting in free markets gives those individuals the most welfare, if you define individual preference satisfaction as welfare, it gives them the most welfare. And so consequently, you get the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics and all of that. There's a tight connection between rational individual behavior and welfare. And consequently, individuals pursuing their own interest, at least in the right institutional structure of market equilibrium and all that, gives you maximum welfare. Once you accept that at least sometimes behavioral economists are right, and what people choose is not exactly what they prefer. It's not exactly right. It's not there are all kinds of context effects, right? You can move the things on the cafeteria line around and get them to change their behavior, right? And so you can't trust what people choose to be what they prefer. And then once you break the link between what people choose being what they prefer, then you break the link between what people choose being that which gives them the most welfare. And so the whole libertarian paternalism is just one approach, but the approach to libertarian paternalism is saying, look, people are not maximizing their utility. They're not getting the most amount of welfare. They're making mistakes. And so what we need to do is we need to nudge them into more rational behavior. And if we nudge them into more rational behavior, we will make them better off. And therefore, right, in Pareto terms, we'll make the society better off because people will have higher welfare in some sense. So libertarian paternalism is libertarian because you don't tell people what to do, you don't restrict what they can do. But it's paternalist in the sense that it says you have preferences that are not being satisfied. You really don't want to eat all that sugar. You really don't want to do all those drugs. And we're going to nudge you into not doing those things, but we're always going to give you the freedom of choice in the process. Anyway, I think most of us know libertarian paternalism, and the language that came out of that was this notion of an econ as an individual that is fully rational, has well-ordered preferences, is not subject to context effects and irreversibilities and all this kind of, or reversibilities and all this kind, irreversibilities, sorry, kinds of things. And then humans that make mistakes all the time and don't maximize their welfare and consume all kinds of things that they really don't want in their heart of hearts. So, okay, let's move on. I'm assuming if people have questions, they can talk about that later. So why am I just talking about libertarian paternalism and not behavioral welfare economics more broadly? One thing is just there's so much literature on behavioral welfare economics. I mean, you can't write a paper and talk about it all. There's too much of it. So why libertarian paternalism? Well, it's the one that's received the most attention, certainly. Both in academic circles and also policy circles. It's an excellent example of behavioral economics inspired by the idea that gained public attention through presented in books aimed at the general reader. Certainly Thayer and Sunstein's books are very, very popular. I mean, I taught this material and it's almost embarrassing. I mean, undergraduates are always giggling at the things they say about, people thinking like Big Blue Computer and all that. I mean, it's a very, very popular presentation. That's not to say the ideas aren't solid academic ideas, but that was very popularized. And then finally it's a policy suggestion that Frank Knight would have really strong opinions on. So that's the reason I focused on libertarian paternalism rather than other kinds of approaches to behavioral welfare economics. So let me try to catch up with you here. Okay, so just to clarify this distinction on traditional paternalism and when I think about traditional paternalism as viewed by mainstream economics, okay, now I'm not talking about, some religious person, how they view paternalism. I'm talking about how mainstream economics traditionally viewed it. And traditionally, mainstream economists, at least in the 20th century, I'm not so sure about the 19th century, but in the 20th century, people basically had preferences that were not good for them. They ate too much sugar, or whatever, but they were maximizing their preferences. They were not behaving irrationally. They just had bad preferences. And so what you do is you tax the good that you want them to quit using, or you subsidize them, or you prohibit it, right? So you're manipulating the prices and the access in ways that makes them consume less of the bad goods that they actually prefer, right? You prefer to smoke cigarettes. Those are bad for you. Let us put a big tax on cigarettes. You prefer to eat, really sugar food. Let me put a tax on that and you'll eat less of it. You'll be better off, but it's against your preferences. So next one. Libertarian paternalism is not that. Libertarian paternalism is a way of saying, look, you have these true preferences, as they're called. But the problem is all of these context effects that are preventing you from actually maximizing your preferences. And so you have these biases that prevent you, right? And so what we're trying to do is to nudge you into doing what you really want to do, but can't do psychologically, because you have all of these heuristics and biases and things that prevent you from doing it. Those are two very different ways of talking about paternalism. And one of the problems about libertarian paternalism, and one of the problems about a lot of the literature on libertarian paternalism, even some of mine, is that a lot of the examples of libertarian paternalism, even in Thaler and Sunstein's books, are not about individual behavior. They're about individual behavior, but they're not about individual welfare. They're about things like, pollution or something that has a social effect. And so you nudge people into not polluting as much or something. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I actually prefer social nudges more than libertarian paternalism. But that's not libertarian paternalism. Paternalism is nudging people into doing what they really want to do, but have these psychological barriers that prevent them from doing it. And it's the reason they call it libertarian paternalism. It's about paternalism. It's not about socialism. It's not about social stuff. It's about individual choice. So, okay, let's move on here. Right. Well, this is, I think, all right. Traditional paternalism treats people like children, making them better off regardless of what they prefer, while libertarian paternalism nudges people into being rational economic agents, better satisfying true preferences. So one more. So I'm an economist. I tend to think in terms of models. So here's our model. There are only two kinds of people in society, econs and humans. Econs are fully rational decision makers, and humans are making rationality mistakes. If you effectively nudged everyone, you effectively nudged all the humans into being econs, then preferences would be better satisfied. And if welfare is individual preference satisfaction, the society would have higher welfare. The movement from some econs, the movement from some econs and some humans to all econs would produce a Pareto improving reallocation. You are increasing the total amount of individual preference satisfaction in the society because these people are not satisfying their preferences. So click. Now this is, I can't even remember if this is in the paper. This is a throwaway. I don't have a proof of this. There's no math here. It's not a proof of this, but it's an interesting idea, something to think about, something to talk about, right? Thus, perfectly effective libertarian paternalist policy would replace the invisible hand of the competitive equilibrium, right? And you say, well, why do you need to replace the first fundamental theorem? Well, the first fundamental theorem assumes that people are all acting optimally on their true preferences. If they're not acting optimally on their true preferences, then total welfare is lower. But if you could nudge them all back to their true preferences, then you would be back to a Pareto solution. A perfectly competitive equilibrium with less than perfectly rational agents is not Pareto efficient, but a perfectly libertarian paternalist nudged one is Pareto efficient. So you're using libertarian paternalism to basically get back to the core, if you want to think about it in those terms. Now, there's a lot of problems with this. I mean, would you have a perfectly competitive equilibrium if you didn't have people actually on their demand curves? And so this is something to think about. I'm not taking this very seriously. Okay, move on. All right, now let's switch away from positive behavioral economics and rational decision making and all of that. Let's talk about social welfare, social action in Knight versus a libertarian paternalist policy that's aimed at making individuals better off by nudging them into more rational behavior. So the question is, what would Knight say about libertarian paternalism? So click. So one more, I think. Yeah. I mean, if you just put your historian's hat on and say, well, if you want to know what Knight would think about libertarian paternalism, why don't you just, see what Knight would say about paternalism in general? Well, it doesn't work. There's just not much there. Knight thought about paternalism in that traditional way of people with having bad preferences and whether we want to tax them into consuming less of these dangerous goods. Or he saw paternalism as a political economic term. He taught it as social paternalism, which was just socialism to him. So he doesn't, he doesn't in any way direct his argument to this libertarian paternalism, which is aimed at sort of making people more rational, making them more like homo economists. That's just not anything Knight talks about. So how are we going to deal with this? If Knight doesn't talk about libertarian paternalism, how can I compare how can I talk about what he would say about libertarian paternalism? Well, I can talk about what Knight says about social welfare, right? And individual welfare. And Knight does not in any way think that welfare is something that you can address in a scientific way. Welfare is about what people value, and science for Knight is about constant conjunctions of sense data. And constant conjunction of sense data is not a value, right? It's what is, not what ought to be. Welfare is not about individual preference satisfaction for Knight. And so let's move over and look at some quotes here. So this is throughout Knight's life. Maybe risk, uncertainty, and profit, that's not the case, but past about the early 1920s. In an earlier paper, the writer undertook to argue against the view of ethics most commonly accepted among economists. So this is individual preference satisfaction and satisfying preferences. The argument was not directed against hedonism as such. So it's as much against ordinal utility theory as it is against cardinal and hedonistic utility, but against scientific ethics of any kind, against any view which sets out from the assumption that human wants are objective and measurable magnitudes, and that the satisfaction of such wants is the essence and criteria of value. and which proceeds on the basis of the assumptions to reduce ethics to a sort of glorified economics. So this is a sweeping critique of utilitarianism, of Pareto, individual preference satisfaction, thinking of welfare, social welfare, or even individual welfare, as a matter of fact, either way in his case, as something that you add up or compare or use scientific methods. We cannot accept want satisfaction as a final criteria of value because we do not in fact regard our wants as final. Instead of resting in the view that there's no disputing about taste, we dispute about them more than anything else. Our most difficult problem in valuation is the evaluation of our wants themselves, and our most troublesome want is the desire for the right kind of want. Now, it's interesting, given that Stiegler was Knight's student, it's interesting how opposite this is of the famous Gustibus paper by Stiegler and Becker, because this is just the opposite. I mean, it's constructed preferences is going to be the argument about why you really can't depend on these things. And so let's see if there's another. No, let's move on to the. So if you can't approach welfare and policies about welfare through a scientific approach at looking at preferences or looking at what people buy and determining preferences and then using those preferences as a measure of welfare, if you can't do any of that, then how do you do social policy? How do you determine welfare? I mean, what is Knight? I mean, Knight is throwing out here, he's throwing out not only Walrasian, Paretian utilitarian kinds of things. He's throwing out, John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. He's throwing it all out. And so what is he going to plug in as the substitute for figuring out what's good? How do we tell? So let's I've got 3 quotes here, but basically, it's basically not something that anyone can decide. It's not a scientific matter. You can't add up the evidence and find the truth. It's something that needs to emerge from social deliberation. In their social super-individual normative characters, values are objective. No discussion, right? But we have to discover them through deliberation. No discussion can be carried on in propositions beginning with the word "I want," right? Isn't that what all utilitarian welfare is? What do I want? What's my preference? What's good for me? How do I get more pleasures and fewer pains? Everyone recognizes the difference between individual preference and what ought to be, between personal taste and good taste, between personal opinion or wish and truth. In social action, action by any group as a group is really social activity, the solution of a social or group problem, consisting in the establishment of an agreement or consensus among individuals who make up the group as to what is desirable. So I mean, this, how much unlike the Chicago school of Becker and Stiegler and Friedman is this? I mean, this is screamingly unlike, although there's an argument, there's an argument that now we'll talk about that, but there is an argument that other elements of the Chicago school are sympathetic, but this idea that you just can't talk about what's right for the society, all you can do is deliberate over it and see what emerges. I mean, you can't add up or run experiments or do anything like that, right? So the bottom line is that for Knight, libertarian paternalism would not be just bad social policy. It wouldn't even be social at all. It would be the complete victory of naturalism that he spent his whole life fighting. So libertarian paternalism is a policy trying to increase welfare by figuring out what people true preferences are and then nudging them into satisfying their true preferences. And that is taking science and using science to run our lives in a way that Knight would not support. Economic rationality says nothing about what one or society should value. It's completely instrumental. If the goal is this, then do this. So the fundamental distinction for Knight here is that rational choice theory is useful in some situations for predicting and explaining some behavior, because you know what the goal is, particularly something like a portfolio choice problem, for instance. Do you want 60-40 bonds in stocks or 40-60 bonds in stocks, right? That's Knight would say, okay, that's narrow enough that you can actually treat it as a scientific problem. But when you're talking about values in the higher sense, social, what kind of society we're going to have, do we care about the poor? Do we not care about the poor? Do we pollute the environment or do we not pollute the environment? Those kinds of things are not questions about that are instrumental, right? And so you have this position in Knight. Now this, as I said in the paper, this may be utopian. It may not be the case that you're going to run a developed society this way. But the point is, for Frank Knight, this is what the social is, and this is what social welfare is. And consequently, libertarian paternalism is really precisely the opposite of what you should be doing. And so in some sense, what behavioral economics does is to reject, to a very great degree, rational choice theory, which Knight thinks has a lot of problems, but also has usefulness. So you're going to reject the part of standard economics that Knight thinks has some value. And then you're going to go to a libertarian paternalist welfare policy that he thinks has no grounding whatsoever. So it's really the worst of both worlds. You criticize the part of standard economics that Knight likes the most and thinks is the most useful, and you destroy the part that he thinks or you elevate the part that he thinks is the least useful. And this paper, the idea of this paper came to me one time reading Knight, 5-6 years ago. And I just remember all I could say is, my God, Knight would despise libertarian paternalism. It is everything that's the opposite of how he thinks about things. It's taking the best of rational choice and criticizing it, and then taking the worst of rational choice and elevating it. And I mean, I think the first part of that is easily defensible. The second part, we'll see how this goes. But anyway, so I only have, that's my argument. My last slide is just a point. I have this footnote about Wittgenstein. Frank Knight was a pluralist. He was a pluralist, a deep pluralist, and yet he has a view of rational choice theory that is extremely narrow, and he has a view of science that is extremely narrow. So if you're a pluralist, why do you want to narrow science? And traditionally, the argument has been, and this is certainly true of logical positivism and logical empiricism, that, sort of 20th century positivism is always viewed as, we're gonna make science hard so we can get rid of all the riffraff. We can get rid of all the existentialism, and we can get rid of all the German idealism, and we can get rid of all these things. We're going to get, science is going to be the only knowledge, and it's going to be very tightly argued. So you're using a narrow definition of science to basically chase away, keep the enemy from the gates or something. But that's not the only way one can use a narrow view of science or a narrow view of logic. And one reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus is that he had a very, very narrow notion of science and logic in there, which the logical positivist picked up on, but didn't understand. So for Wittgenstein, and again, I'm no Wittgenstein scholar. I'm not saying that I am. This is a standard reading of Wittgenstein. I don't know enough to know whether, how to weight it relative to other readings. But that the idea was to make science and logic and math narrow enough not to prevent other things from getting in, but to leave more field for other things. And in Wittgenstein's case, it's religion and mysticism and all kinds of things. I think Knight had a narrow view of rational choice theory and a narrow view of science in general for that kind of reason. Now, not to let in mysticism or religion. Frank Knight despised religion. It's not to let in mysticism or religion, but it's to let in other secular humanist ideas, whether it be history, whether it be anthropology, whether it be, all kinds of things. So, big pluralist science, right? But so it's still science, it's not mysticism, right? So you're doing the line of demarcation quite differently. You're saying, let's have a narrow conception of these individual sciences, but let's have quite a few of these individual sciences. Anyway, that I don't know. We can talk about that. There's a reason this is in the last page. It's kind of a throwaway thought. So anyway, that's me. I think I just said that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wade. So can I maybe stop the sharing or?
Yes, please do.
But of course, I can reactivate the sharing if people wanted to ask you specific questions about some of the slides.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Wade, for this wonderful, very clear, very insightful talk. So many philosophically rich ideas, really. I have so many ideas in the paper and also in the talk. I think many of these ideas would actually, each of them would merit like another paper on their own. For example, the very last point about the idea of narrowing down science in order to open up the space for other forms of, in this case, also rational, I tend to think, right? Other forms of rational thinking, which is, as you said, the difference with Wittgenstein, because it's not missing to them, but it's other forms of rational inquiry. Raphael, are you there? Is Raphael?
No,
okay.
I'm here, but in terrible conditions. So because my flight was delayed, and so I'm still waiting for the metro in Paris. But I think if you can hear me, I can do a concise presentation and say everything I have to say. So do you hear me correctly?
I can hear you very well, actually. Yes, I do. So,
okay.
So just before I give you the floor, so Raphael Azega, who is a PhD student at the Walras-Pareto Center in Lausanne, who is doing a PhD under the supervision of Steve Medema and Haro Mas. And so, yes, he's been working a lot on Frank Knight. And so, Raphael, please, the floor is yours for your discussion.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and hi, Wade. Thank you for your paper. It was real an honor for me to comment it, and also because you wrote an article in '97 about Frank Knight's pluralism that's still a landmark for me, and you reuse it in your paper on behavioral economics. So thank you for this. And unfortunately, I didn't know so much about behavioral economics, but it was very interesting to discover it better through this comparison with Knight, and especially to see that modern empirical tools kind of helped reach the same conclusion as Knight reached. And it's funny because in a sense, Knight's epistemological position can seem a little bit odd sometimes with his common sense introspective method, and the fact that he anticipated so well the conclusions that those empirical methods would reach, I think is very interesting, and we should wonder why and wasn't Knight right 100 years ago about methodology in this sense. And there are also really interesting remarks passing by. Like, I didn't notice the fact that, for example, Knight did not use expected utility, although he was one of the first one to introduce the question of risk and probabilities into economic theory. So in this comparison between behavioral economics and Knight, I think one thing that you raise is the difference of pluralism and methodology. And I think Knight had this very eclectic education. He wanted to be a philosopher too, and he studied at a time when philosophy still tried to bring unity to the various sciences. And I think how Knight defines economics always has to be thought in relationship with how he defines other sciences, because all those disciplines are supposed to be complementary, and there is some kind of logic within those what those various disciplines can say. And I think the context changes a lot regarding to this after the Second World War. This is very obvious in the case of the Second Chicago School, when this phenomenon of economic imperialism is starting, when the point is not to bring unity to the disciplines, but there is a competition between the various disciplines that is starting probably also from Kuhn's ideas. And so every science, social science, is trying to take over the field of other sciences. And I think this is an important contextual factor of the different conclusions that they reach. So I want to ask you first about this question of methodology. If we go back to Knight's common sense introspective approach, what would be the conclusion from behavioral economics that could be included in economic theory, or what should belong to other disciplines? Because in fact, in 1922, of course, I agree with you that Knight does not like the use of statistics too much, of being empirical in this sense. But in 1922, he says that actually statistical science has a place within this pluralistic system. So there is a place for studying society with like statistical irregularities. So I'm not sure he really hates it. I think the reason he doesn't like it is more about the problem of control from authority than from a purely scientific way. And I also think that his narrow view of science, I'm not sure he has such a narrow view of science. For example, in his article about economic psychology and the value problem in 1925, he mentions that there could be different ways of saying what is science. So of course, when he talks about science, he talks about science usually in the strictest sense and as an exact science. And I think he mentions it already in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, saying like economics is the only science that can pretend to be an exact science. But I'm not sure it really means that statistics should not be used, although it would be delusional to use statistics too much to control society, because as you mentioned, social control should arise from society itself, from social discussion. So yes, I wondered at the end of this presentation what we need to keep from Knight and what we need to keep from the conclusion of behavioral economics. So that's one question, but it's not the only thing. The second point that I would like to mention is the fact that in Knight there is this strong idea of perfectibility of humans, perfectibility of society. So he's not only saying that humans are very dynamic, they are changing all the time, but he's also hoping, and that's probably the German idealism heritage. In my reading, he's hoping for humanity to reach some kind of a destiny, and this is probably strongly connected to his project of democracy as government by discussion. So to increase the discussion, and so in the framework of this perfectibility, I think he believes that rationality also should be improved. So, of course, he sees a great danger with this individualistic, asocial called rationality. And this is very close to Max Weber. He sees a danger in it. But he also says that humans, in a sense, are not rational enough. They are not rational enough to deal with their own problems. And maybe if we try to apply also Frank Knight to the environmental issues, I think that's quite blatant. And so probably, yeah, I'm pretty sure that, as you said, he would despise this paternalistic libertarianism, but he would still be aware that we might rationally have ends that we do not succeed fulfilling because we are too weak. In the 30s, he compares the Greek notion of ethics and the Christian notion of ethics, the Greek being that you never act immorally if you have the consciousness, and the Christian is that you may act immorally even though you have the consciousness of what is good. And so probably there is something to dig here, and that rationality is not enough developed. Also, he uses the term intelligence, but here the definitions are very difficult with Knight because it's never very steady. But rationality probably is also a value, and he refers to the period of the Enlightenment as really the reference point, hoping that this hope of the Enlightenment of developing human rationality would be once fulfilled. And the second point is still about rationality, but more about the definition. I think that Knight uses this very individualistic conception of reality in the framework of his pluralism. So it has some kind of it is some kind of starting point to take individual absolute rationality, and then it has to be somehow denied to some extent. But maybe the libertarians, they use a little bit of a different conception of rationality. So I'm not very sure to what extent we can oppose them according to their notion of rationality. And the last point I think I want to raise is about the question of welfare. I am not sure that welfare has no role whatsoever in ethics. maybe I don't, that's my reading, but I think that welfare is important because he regularly attacks the apostles of asceticism who want to solve the problems of modern civilization through asceticism. And he says, well, wants are important too. And he says it in the ethics of competition. So the good thing with modern society is that we have all this production, but of course the challenge is to ethically think about this production, how we can use that, how we can distribute it. So I think that's it for me. Thank you again, and maybe yeah, that would be nice. I'm not sure if that's really your aim in this paper, but to insist on this idea of the social discussion, that it's really nice social project to boost this social discussion, this democratic discussion. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Raphael. Wonderful. So Wade, back to you.
Yeah, a couple things. I hope I didn't sound like Frank Knight would be against statistics if Frank Knight were still living. I mean, Frank Knight's idea that, you know, that we shouldn't use scientific statistics, we should use introspection and common sense, was not some universal argument. That's just where he was. I mean, that's the way. I mean, so let me back up a bit. Why do we have a field of economic methodology? Why did we ever have it? Why did John Stuart Mill write a separate chapter to his book on science? Why is it that we had Neville Keynes writing a book on methodology? Why did Robbins write a book on methodology? Why did Milton Friedman write a paper that was on methodology? Why do you need economic methodology? I mean, if economics is a science and philosophers of science know what science is, we're done. The whole reason we had a field of economic methodology is the presumption was that we can't do test in economics. Mill says it, Robbins says it, you know, Friedman says it in 52 or whatever. And so I mean, this was not an argument against statistics because he didn't like it or didn't trust it. Although I do think there's a social thing. I think you're right about the you know, the sort of control aspect of it. I think in his heart he had a reaction to it. He just didn't think it worked in social science, that there were too many variables, and he was not particularly impressed with Henry Schultz at Chicago, who was doing, you know, demand theory statistically. He had been a student of Moore's, and you know, there was all that buzz in Chicago about, you know, you read Stigler's 2 papers on empirical demand theory, and you know, Stigler would be with Friedman on it. It's not that the concept is a problem. It's we can't get anything out of it yet. We don't have enough stuff. We don't have enough tools. We don't have enough data. We don't have enough of anything. So I mean, I wouldn't put I wouldn't put Knight as someone who didn't think that once we have more tools and once we have more data, that statistics isn't a reasonable thing. It's just that in the 1930s and 1940s, all you had to go on was common sense. So I think that's one issue. It's just where everybody was in some sense at the time, or where the vast majority of people were at the time, that statistics was good in physics and maybe even in biology, but it's just not going to work in economics. I always like John Stuart Mill's story about how could you have an empirical test of Ricardo's theory, right? Ricardo said you started out with Britain as an island. There was no one on it. People came to the island. They settled the most fertile land first, and then they moved up to the less and less fertile land. And as they moved up to the less and less fertile land, the rents went up on the fertile land, right? I mean, so now we're going to get two islands and put people on them and see what happens. I mean, it's crazy. You can't do those kinds of tests. You can't do tests in that kind of thing. So anyway, that I guess that's just one point on the statistics. He didn't like it, but his reasons for not liking it wasn't particularly unique to Frank Knight, and I think he'd be fine with it now, as long as it's in a mix of other ways of talking about things. On the perfectibility, I mean, I think Frank Knight is like many of us. We all want to be rational, but if you look at 2,000 years of secular philosophy and secular social science and all that, it's very, very hard to get a good definition of what rationality is and a usable definition of what rationality is, except for instrumental rationality. Instrumental rationality is clear. It may be a silly notion or a dangerous notion of rationality. It's not the only notion of rationality, but it's clear, right? If I have a goal to do something and I have information about the constraints that I face, then it's rational to do certain things and not rational to do other things. As I always said when I was teaching, it's instrumental rationality. You don't always have an optimal solution, but if the room catches on fire and we have to get out, I suggest that you don't run into the blackboard or run into the wall, that you either run out the window or you run out the door, right? There's a, given your goal, there's a rational solution to that goal. Now, your goal could be to commit mass murder, right? I mean, so there's nothing ethical about it at all. And so I think that Knight was in the same position as many of us, and that is that we would like to have a notion of rationality that is broader and more robust, but it's hard. It's just hard. It's, Plato, Aristotle, Kant. I mean, name somebody who hasn't wrestled with this. On the other hand, instrumental rationality is at least tractable, right? If you know what the goal is, do. And then what Knight would add to that is, in economics, sometimes the goal is narrowly enough defined and the conditions are narrowly enough defined. Again, portfolio choice, right? Something like that. And so you use instrumental rationality in the few cases where you have enough control over, what the goal is, and all the relevant variables, and you also know which direction you need to move to get to the better place. But that's not because instrumental rationality is deep or significant or the best way of thinking about rationality. It's just manageable. It's just sometimes manageable, but it doesn't do much, right? I mean, this was the whole point of Knight's criticism of rational choice theory. I mean, yeah. I mean, you can say a few things with it. That's it, a few things. What if you have bigger questions? Well, let's all get together and talk about it. That's about the best we can do. So anyway, okay. Yeah, the welfare ethics thing, I think for Knight, welfare and ethics are connected. I've never been one that I never could understand. I mean, maybe I spent too much time for a while with Scott Gordon and Mark Blogg. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine how welfare could not be ethical. I mean, if you you know, if you say, I mean, one of the ways that Pareto welfare economics got to be non-ethical was that we defined something called Pareto optimality. And Pareto optimality, as we all know, is a situation in which you can't make one person better off without making someone else worse off. And if you build a model and you give everybody utility functions and you do various things, you can find a Pareto optimal solution. And you might even be able to find a Pareto optimal solution among a small number of people in a real world situation. So simply labeling this allocation as Pareto optimal, that really doesn't involve ethics, right? This allocation in this model or in this society is Pareto optimal, or this, it might be hard to figure out, but there's a there. But that doesn't tell you anything about welfare economics. I mean, welfare economics tells us what we ought to do. I mean, just as soon as you say that this is a Pareto optimal allocation and a Pareto optimal allocation is a good allocation, you're done. You're now in ethics, right? You're in individual preference satisfaction ethics, but you have moved to a point of ethics. So I don't see how in any useful way you can separate welfare and ethics. And I don't think Frank Knight saw how you could separate welfare and ethics. And I frankly don't think anybody in the right mind, other than a few Walrasians in the middle of the 20th century, thought they'd figured out a way to get it. I wrote a paper a long time ago on Mark Blog versus Hennebeton, I can't pronounce his name. Anyway, there was a long debate about whether Pareto welfare economics is normative or not between Mark Blog and someone else that I can't remember the name, but anyway, it came out to me to be so clear that Blog was right. I mean, Pareto optimality is an ethical notion. It's an ethical notion built on the idea that individual preference satisfaction is good. So it could be a horrible ethical notion, but it's an ethical notion, right? So there's a difference between agreeing with is good ethics. I'm going on and on and on, and maybe someone else would like to talk. Sorry.
No, not at all, actually, because what you were saying was really interesting. So it was nice actually listening to your reply to Raphael's points. I would ask maybe others. I have so many questions, but if I ask questions, I'm afraid the others might not have enough time to ask questions. So I would rather them ask their questions, and if you had time, then I would also ask my own questions. So the floor is yours. The others, please come forward for your questions, comments. Anyone, please? Specifically, the ladies present, I strongly encourage you to please come forward and whether comment the talk, the discussions, or ask questions. No, you don't want to? Okay, so I'm going to maybe start myself. Maybe that way others would feel easier asking questions. So thank you so much, Wade. I have more specifically, I would maybe start with two questions about Knight. One is about in how to put it, in normative philosophy, political philosophy, distinction between contractarians and contractualists. If, as he says, basically social discussion, you cannot start it with this idea of I want, that he finds completely appalling. Does that make him a contractualist? is he therefore an anti-contractarian? And if he is, because by saying that, because for contractarian, precisely, it is your interest, so it's what you want that is important in the discussion. Whereas he says that that should not be the starting point if you want to have a true discussion. But am I right to infer from that he's not a contractarian? Does that mean that he's an anti-contractarian? And does that make him into a contractualist in this idea of a dialogue? Is it dialogue in the contractualist sense, or what is, for example, what would be his position about certain strands of social choice theory about the voting mechanism? Like a discussion involved, would that involve a voting at the end also? Or is that just discussion that would somehow lead to a consensus? So is it consensus that is the aim of the discussion, or is it another form of deliberation, which would, for example, imply voting? So that's maybe the first question.
Yeah, I'm probably not, you're probably, Ross Emmett is a better person to talk to about political philosophy questions and Frank Knight. I may not be very good on this. To me, Knight talking about you can't start with I want. This is one of the things you have to remember about Frank Knight is he almost never tells you what he supports. He almost never tells you what's the right thing to do. He's a critic. He shoots down things. And so what is clear from the I want quote is you won't have anything social if you all get together with I want. And so in that sense, if we all are only motivated with I want, you're not going to end up at anything social. You're going to end up with wealth and power or whatever, brute force, whatever. Somebody's going to win. Somebody's going to lose. You can trade. Now, this is the beauty of competitive markets. You can go into a competitive market with I want this, and the person who is on the other side says, I want to sell this, and you can establish a price, and that's fine. I mean, that's the nice thing about markets. You don't have to do this, but those aren't social. Those are individual for Knight now. And so I mean, it's really a criticism of any kind of welfarist approach to welfare, right? Where you're taking individual people have self-interested preferences, and then you somehow add them up or take the average or even I assume you would extend it to even a contractarian thing where you sort of let them sort things out and find happy mediums that they can live with or whatever. So, but that's a different thing than saying you can't ever have a decent society by Frank Knight's standard if some people in the conversation only care about what I want. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. If everybody only cares about I want, he says he's going to say it's a problem. That's why you have markets. That's why markets are nice. And that's why we should, that's why markets aren't social in that sense. That's why you say, right? I mean, you don't have a society in a market. You have individuals transacting with each other. But to say somehow I want completely destroys any kind of thing that he would think would be the right way to do it. I don't know. I just don't have any idea. I don't know if that helps.
No, it does actually, and so I think that the second point would be that it seems to me that by having this idea of market, if I get it correctly, as a sort of really representing a narrow economic sphere and opposing this idea of market as a sort of model for the entire social life, one may argue that he is by no means a neoliberal if we get by neoliberal this idea that for classical liberal market was the economic sphere, neoliberals try to extend this economic sphere to the entire social sphere by generalizing the logic of the market from a strictly limited thing to basically embodying social logic per se. In that sense, because I often find it interesting to say that among the founders and the members of the Mount Panorama Society, there were obviously people who, Popper is for me a very good example, someone that you cannot characterize as a neoliberal. But it seems to me that Knight also is by no means a neoliberal then, right? In the sense that he's by arguing that basically there are so many social questions that should be dealt with through non-market mechanisms. This is precisely what is not supposed to be the idea maybe of neoliberal, or at least what people like Mirovsky call neoliberals.
Yeah, I have trouble with the term neoliberal because it's just one of those things, that has to me so many different meanings and different connotations. And I remember arguing with Phil Murawski 20 years ago over neoliberalism, and I never could get anywhere because I everything he hated, I hate, but I don't know that I would define it the way he hated it. So, but this idea that somehow you can solve political problems by markets, that in some sense markets are enough, that you use the government to create more markets, not use the government to block markets. That idea, I mean, Knight would certainly be opposed to that. I mean, if that's your definition, there are other definitions, but and I think a good example is that there's one little place in the paper where I talk about Knight actually saying something against Adam Smith. And the argument is not that the invisible hand is not a good thing. It's that the invisible hand is not a good thing because we get more goods and services. More goods and services is what you get from the exchange process. That may or may not be good, right? That may not, or you're right. So I mean, basically the argument is something like from Knight's point of view, if markets give you more freedom, and freedom is actually a value that is something that's valued, then free markets should be good because they're free, not because they make stuff. I mean, they do make stuff, but that there's no jump between making more stuff and being good, or being, a higher moral plane or something, right? And so you have this jump from the sort of invisible hand kind of argument to some sort of moral praise, and Knight wouldn't accept that reason for defending the free market. I mean, if you're in a society that are a whole bunch of libertarians and everybody values freedom more than they value welfare or justice, then you should have a free market. Right? but talking about a free market because you get more goods and services doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what is good or social or anything. Is that helpful at all? I mean, it's not easy ground, I'll tell you. These things are, deciding what Knight, talking about things Knight didn't like is pretty easy. Talking about what he would put in their place is really difficult.
No, absolutely. It's very, very, very interesting what you're saying, because, for example, this book by Notorno on Hayek and Popper, he also raises this point that, for example, for Popper, the good thing about liberalism and even the market economy is the freedom. It's like freedom as basically free market as a relatively free market, because Popper was not really an advocate of free market, radical free market, but still it's the value of freedom that matters, whereas Notorno's argument is that for Hayek, it is precisely the consequences of the free market, economically speaking, that makes it a desirable instrument. But the whole point is that for him, Hayek is an advocate of what he calls economism, whereas Popper is opposed to economism. But what you say about Knight, it's interesting because the next week we will have Yannick Wasserman, who will give a talk about the Austrian school, and in his book, at some point he refers to Morgenstern's paper, I think, from the 30s on the limits of economic science, something like that. When he wrote that, he says, Wasserman, he refers to this correspondence between Knight and Morgenstern, where Knight calls him, basically writes to him and tells him that it's interesting, his points in the book or in the paper, but it is unfortunate that such an acute mind is spending most of his time trying to criticize and, as we say maybe nowadays, deconstruct things instead of trying to make, how to put it, maybe like really contributing positively to economics. So it's interesting, this idea that at the end of the day, he himself is more, it's much easier, like he's clearer when he's really criticizing other positions, whereas when it comes to positively characterizing what, for example, economics should be, his ideas are harder to grasp. So on that point, it's interesting why he. May I, others, if you have, maybe you have managed to. Yes, please. I see a hand raised. Soroush, please. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you well, yes.
Thanks for the great talk. So at the beginning, you mentioned that Knight apparently changed his mind about the merits of rational choice theory throughout his career. And then I understood it in the way that he had basically belief in the high explanatory power of this theory, but gradually thought that maybe it can work only in certain domains of application. I was just curious if you can tell us more about this shift, and if we know at all what basically drove this shift. Was it because he basically made certain observations, or he read, I know, some ideas, some thinkers, some books? Do we know anything about what can explain his shift of thought on the explanatory power of RCT? Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's some really good work on this, and it's not, I'm not doing it. Ross Emmett has written quite a bit about this, and I forget, I know him and I'm spacing his name. Begins with an F. Hold on. Anyway, it's Luca Pareto. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. There's a reference in the paper, if you have the paper, on like 5 or 6 things that have been on this issue, and sort of what caused Knight to, now again, as I was trying to make clear, I mean, Knight was never 100% rational choice theory is all we ever have to do in economics, and he never gave it up. But you want to think of it as, you know, early on it was, you know, 70% useful or something, and by the end of his life it was more like 15% useful, right? I mean, something like that. And this whole thing has to do with just the evolution of Frank Knight and the evolution of society. I mean, it's really not what I do well. It's what I like to read about when other people do it, but it's really history that is steeped in the context and how the individual changes. I mean, you're talking about going through the Great Depression and World War I and the Great Depression and then World War II and the rise of communism and the rise of Nazism. And worst of all, for not worst of all, but just as bad for Knight was the rise of Keynesianism. And because he saw those things as very similar. And so it really is this sort of his fading optimism about human social life in general, right? And to understand that, you have to understand Frank Knight, not in the way that I do, which is reading his words, but you have to really do serious historical biography. You have to, right? And Ross Emmett was going to write the biography a long time ago. And so that, I mean, so that there are better sources on that than me. It has to do with the changing culture and him being embedded in it, and then sort of what he saw as a young man that a scholar does, and then
Wade, I think you got muted. I don't know why, but
am I here? Was all of that
yes.
muted?
No.
Just
Just the past 5 seconds or
Oh,
something.
good. Let me just take 2 seconds here and see if I can find a Knight quote
sure.
that I think is appropriate. There was one particularly on this thing from the way he was as a young man and the way he was.
Do you mind if I ask a
Go on.
quick
Yeah, go
follow-up?
on. Sorry, this is not, I probably shouldn't be doing this.
No, thank you so much.
I
So yeah, I was
people.
also, right.
Yeah, I deter people from asking questions by having long answers, so I'll stop. But there's a couple of good Knight quotes where he actually just in a very pithy way says, you know, when I was a young man, I saw this, and when I was in my middle age, I saw this, and then when I was older, I saw this, and you know, he is self-conscious of this transformation himself. Anyway, sorry.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So just a quick follow-up on this. Is this shift of thought only about the explanatory power of RCT that you're saying? For example, it started from 70%, perhaps to 30% or something like that. Or he also, I'm just wondering, maybe he started with thinking about RCT as something useful for explanation and later on for prescription, or maybe sort of like interpretative shift, something similar like the paper that you have on the interpretative shift of rational choice theory after the emergence of behavioral economics. So I was just wondering if something similar can be found for the case of Knight throughout his career.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong on this. You know, Knight's hard, but I don't. To me, Knight didn't change his view of rational choice ever, even from his thesis. What he changed was the applicability of rational choice theory to actual individual human behavior, and that fewer and fewer things. It seemed to be capable of predicting and explaining. He lost faith in its ability to predict and explain actual behavior, but never gave it up. But he didn't change, I don't think, and there's others that would disagree. But I don't think he changed his definition of rational choice. He changed his belief in the empirical effectiveness of rational choice or explanatory power of rational choice or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have still time maybe for one or two last questions. I
could I say something about the comment about Popper and Hayek?
Yes, please, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes,
I mean, because I'm reading Bruce Caldwell's extraordinary book on Hayek. I'm almost done, but he has a big section on Hayek and Popper, and of course, I mean, Bruce is someone who spent his life with Hayek and Popper. I mean, he knew a lot about Popper, and then became the world's foremost authority on Hayek. So he actually knows those two. But as I was reading that section, I kept saying, why don't we put Knight in here? I mean, because I mean, there seems to be so much closeness, but yet a difference among the three, not just among the two, right? And I think that would be an interesting story, is that taking that question of, you know, political economy Popper, political economy Knight, and then political economy Popper, Hayek, and then add Knight and talk about the cross things and the relationships, because I think that would be very interesting. I don't necessarily know how I think it would come out, because Knight was certainly not a piecemeal social kind of guy, but then there were other things that he sounds fairly Popperian on, and anyway, anyway.
interesting. Thank you so much. Yes. I didn't know that Bruce also discusses Popper in the biography, or
yeah.
it's okay.
It's an extraordinary biography. I mean, you learn a lot about Hayek, of course, but I mean, I learned things about Keynes. I thought I knew as much as Bruce did about Keynes, and lo and behold, that's not true. Because in following Hayek's path, you know, through the war and economic policy and everything else, and so yeah, it's an extraordinary book, and a lot about Austrian economics, a lot about Mises and Robbins' evolution, because he changes very much over his life, and yeah, it's good on Hayek, of course, but it's good on a lot of other stuff too.
Interesting. Thank you. Yes, I will definitely check it out, and I think others should also, given what you just said. Absolutely. Time for one last question. So, does anyone, specifically one of the ladies present, do you want to come forward, maybe for a comment, question? No? So if not, I would maybe ask myself the very last question. When I read the paper, I think I got it, but now when listening to your presentation, I was wondering whether his critique of behavioral welfare economics contains, I mean, the way you constructed his critique, what would be his critique of behavioral welfare economics? Is there anything into this critique which basically is beyond what would be his critique of welfare economics tout court, in the sense that this idea of taking the satisfaction of individual preferences as in any way constituting basically a measure of social progress? It seems to me that, specifically in your talk, it is this point that is problematized. But this point seems to me that is the point that behavioral welfare economics shares with standard welfare economics, at least the Paretian welfare economics, of course. The idea that you get from a worse to a better situation if you get to these people get to satisfy their preferences more in the new situation than in the previous situation. Isn't that the common point between the two kinds of welfare economics? And in that sense, what is the specific critique of behavioral welfare economics in Knight, which is not just a critique of welfare economics as such, but a critique of behavioral welfare economics? I don't know if I'm clear in my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that I mean, I hope I didn't say this is Knight's view of behavioral welfare. This is what Knight would say about behavioral welfare economics. I hope I didn't say that. I hope what I said is, this is what Knight said about behavioral welfare economics, but we're only going to talk about one kind of behavioral welfare economics. We're only going to talk about libertarian paternalism. And again, there's a lot of reasons for doing that. There is just so much going on right now in behavioral welfare economics. And a lot of it is not welfarist in the sense. I mean, it starts with Sen's capabilities or something. John Davis's soon to come out book, and others. I mean, you know, there's all, you know, there's a lot of behavioral welfare economics, and to some extent, Sugden's community of advantage or whatever it is. I mean, so there's a lot of behavioral welfare economics that I think Knight would have things to say about any of those approaches, but they wouldn't be the same thing. Where when you go over to libertarian paternalism, and you have to be careful with that, because there's also sort of libertarian paternalism has been sort of mutated or morphed into a social policy for keeping us from polluting and things like that, but that's not the original. With libertarian paternalism, where you have econs and you have humans and all that, then Knight has, I think Knight would have a really hard criticism of that. And the criticism is just exactly that you're building on the worst part of economics for that purpose. You're building on, you're trying to make everybody into homo economists, and that is fine to talk about markets and to talk about this or that. Nothing wrong with it, but it's only in specific context. You don't want to be starting to run a society that way, and so on and so forth. So I think that Knight's critique is just on that one issue, if he were talking about libertarian paternalism, and if he saw libertarian paternalism the way that I do, or Bob Sugden does, or Dan Hausman does, or a number of other people that have that inner rational agent view. Not everybody does. But then if you just open up this whole thing of behavioral welfare economics, I mean, there's so many different things, and I'm sure he'd have something to say about any of them, but I can't generalize on what that would be, is it? Yeah.
Interesting. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ortrud, do you want to ask the last question, or did you want to say something?
No, I just want to say thank you, because it was very, very interesting and very clear. Unfortunately, I think I never got hold of the papers or texts of Frank Knight that I wanted to get hold on, because well, in the Hamburg library, university library, I simply couldn't get it. So it was very interesting and very informative, and yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. And I also should apologize, because sometimes I go on and on and on, and I sometimes think it discourages questions and comments, because people know I'm going on and on and on. They don't want to ask any questions. But anyway, I hope you found it intriguing, at least. So.
Very, very intriguing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Wade. Really, the talk was excellently clear, very, very insightful. Again, so many different ideas, major ideas. I think that to the idea. I really encourage you to develop these ideas, specifically the point that you were raising at the very end about this notion of having different understandings of science, but because you have different understandings of things that go beyond science. and what they stand for. I think that's a very interesting idea, I would say. But of course, all the other ideas also in the paper. So, but beyond the talk, I think those of you who were here, if you haven't read the paper, I think read the paper, because there are also other very interesting ideas in the paper. And of course, also read other writings by Wade, because all of them are always extremely clear and extremely insightful. So thank you so much, Wade. I really appreciate
I think this paper, I mean, this paper has been accepted by the European Journal of the History of Economic Thought. And I haven't looked, but I think it may be on the website as a, you know, as a DOI, as the version without page numbers. It's not in print yet, and it will be years, but at least it's there. And there's also there's an older version on SSRN, and if you want a copy, I can always send it to you. So email me. So
great. Thank you so much, Wade. Really, it was a huge pleasure having you here with us. I really appreciate your time and the fact that you allowed us to listen to you. Just before we leave, please remember that next week, same time, 6 p.m., 8 p.m. Central Europe time, we will listen to Yannick Wasserman, who will talk about the evolution of the Austrian school from Karl Menger, von Babeck, and Wieser, the founders, in a way, up to, let's say, more recent strands of Austrian economics, which are mostly inspired by Hayek and Mises. So it's going to be a very interesting talk, I think, specifically Yannick's book, The Marginal Revolutionaries, I think is a very interesting book. So if you are free, don't hesitate to come and join us for next week's talk. Again, thank you to all of you for your participation, and hope to see you very soon.
Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you.